So let's talk about the 1920s and 30s in India. The call for independence was getting louder and louder. But this wasn't just one simple story, not at all. Think of it more like a massive, complex tapestry woven with different ideas, different struggles, and so many different voices, all fighting for their version of freedom. Today, we're going to try and unravel that tapestry.
Okay, so what made Indian nationalism so different, right? Well, if you look at Europe, nationalism was usually about carving up old empires into new, separate nation-states. But in India and a lot of other colonies, it was kind of the exact opposite. It was the struggle itself against a common enemy that started to glue all these incredibly different groups of people together. This shared anti-colonial fight became the very thing that forged a new national identity.
All right, here's what we're going to cover. We'll kick things off with the conditions that really set the stage. Then we'll dive into Gandhi's radical idea of nonviolent protest and see how its first big test went down. We'll also explore what freedom really meant to different people on the ground, witness the iconic Salt March, and finally, look at the very real challenges of holding all these different voices together.
So let's dive into our first section. The years right after World War I should have been a time of relief, right? But for India, it was anything but. It actually brought a whole new storm of economic and political crises.
See, to pay for their war, the British cranked up the pressure on India with massive taxes and loans. You can imagine what that did. Prices for everything basically doubled, hitting everyday people incredibly hard. On top of that, forcing people from villages to join the army created huge anger. And as if that wasn't enough, crops were failing and a devastating influenza epidemic was sweeping the country. It was just one thing after another.
And the human cost, it's just staggering. We're talking about an estimated 13 million people who died from famine and disease in just a few years. All this suffering created this deep, powerful sense of grievance. People hoped the war would end their hardships, but things just got worse. So you have all this suffering, all this anger. It was the perfect fertile ground for a totally new kind of struggle.
And right into this pressure cooker steps a new leader, Mahatma Gandhi, fresh from his time in South Africa. And he came back to India with more than just experience. He brought a totally revolutionary idea about how to fight back against injustice.
He called it satyagraha. And look, this was a wild idea at the time. The thought that you could win a battle not with guns and violence, but through nonviolent resistance. The whole idea was that if your cause was true, and if you patiently put up with the suffering inflicted on you, you could actually appeal to the conscience of your oppressor and force them to see the truth. And you can hear it in his own words. It's not about physical strength, it's pure soul force. So for him, this wasn't a weak person's tool. No way. This required incredible moral courage. The goal wasn't to inflict pain, but to endure it, to win the other side over. He truly believed this dharma, or duty, of nonviolence could unite every single Indian.
Okay, so how did this radical idea work in the real world? Well, its first big test on a national stage was the non-cooperation movement, which kicked off back in 1921.
Gandhi's thinking was actually pretty simple. He said, hey, British rule in India only works because we Indians cooperate with it. So what if we just stopped? He laid out this step-by-step plan. Start small, with symbolic things like giving back government titles. Then ramp it up to a full-on boycott of everything, courts, schools, and especially foreign goods. And if the government got tough, they'd be ready to launch an even bigger campaign. And you know what? It had a huge economic impact right away. Boycotting foreign goods, especially cloth, really hit the British where it hurt. Check this out. In just 1 year, the value of imported cloth was basically cut in half. That's huge. People were literally building giant bonfires of foreign cloth and switching to wearing only Indian-made textiles.
But, and this is a big but, this whole massive experiment hit a wall. There was an incident at a place called Chori Chora where a protest turned violent and people died. For Gandhi, that was it. That was the deal breaker. He felt that people just weren't ready for a purely nonviolent movement, and he called the whole thing off. It was a tough lesson in just how hard it is to keep that kind of discipline on such a massive scale.
All right, so everyone was chanting this word, Swaraj, self-rule. It was the rallying cry. But here's the fascinating part. What did that word actually mean to people? Because once you started asking around, you realized the answer was very, very different depending on who you were.
If you were a peasant in the Awadh region, for example, Swaraj wasn't some fancy political idea. No, it was about survival. It meant an end to the sky-high rents from landlords and putting a stop to being forced to work for free. Freedom for them meant economic justice, food on the table, and basic human dignity.
Then you go to the Goodam Hills and you find a totally different story with the tribal communities. The British had closed off huge parts of the forest, which cut people off from their traditional way of life. They couldn't graze their cattle or gather food. For them, Swaraj meant getting back into those forests. It was about their land, their livelihood, their whole culture.
And what about the plantation workers in Assam? For them, Swaraj was something so simple, yet so profound. They were basically trapped on these tea plantations by law. So for them, freedom was the dream that Gandhi Raj was coming, a time when they could finally just go home. That's all they wanted.
Okay, so fast forward to the late 1920s. The movement needed a spark, and Gandhi knew he had to find a new symbol that could unite all these different dreams of freedom. And he landed on something so simple, so everyday, that it was pure genius: salt. Now, why salt? Because the British government had a monopoly on it and taxed it, which meant it affected every single person in India, rich or poor. It was an injustice everyone could understand.
So, to protest this salt tax, Gandhi announces this incredibly dramatic act of defiance. He was going to lead a march to the sea to make his own salt. And we're talking an epic scale here, a 240-mile journey, all on foot, from his ashram all the way to the coast.
Think about that. For nearly a month, 24 days, the entire country, and frankly the world, was watching. They walked about 10 miles a day, and every town they stopped in, huge crowds would gather to hear Gandhi speak. The whole thing was captivating.
And get this! It started with just a small group of 78 trusted volunteers. But as they walked, more and more people joined. By the time they hit the coastal town of Dandi, thousands were there. And on April 6, 1930, Gandhi reached down, picked up some muddy salt from the ground, boiled it, and ceremonially broke the British law.
And that one simple act, it kicked off the entire civil disobedience movement. So what was different this time? Why was this a bigger deal than the non-cooperation movement? Well, now people weren't just being asked to not cooperate, they were being asked to go out and actively break colonial laws. This was a whole new level of nationwide defiance.
But even as this new, powerful wave of protest was sweeping across India, it also started to expose the deep cracks in the foundation of this supposedly unified movement. The very idea of one single Indian nation was being challenged from the inside.
You had the Dalits, who are fighting their own battle for freedom. Their incredible leader, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, made the powerful argument that political freedom from the British meant nothing without social freedom and real political power for his people. He demanded separate electorates so they could choose their own leaders. At the same time, many Muslim leaders, like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, were deeply worried that their culture and identity would be swallowed up in a Hindu-majority India, so they pushed hard for political safeguards. And that right there is the central tension of the entire Indian independence struggle. See, it was never just a simple story of India versus the British. It was also this incredibly complex, sometimes painful, negotiation within India to try and build one nation that could somehow make room for all these different and often competing ideas of what freedom really was, a challenge that would go on to shape the future of an entire subcontinent.